My father's second wife laughed when he died. Finally, the house is ours. Her daughter shouted with joy. I stood silently at the door, keys in hand. When I pulled out the property deed, their faces transformed in horror. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning. 7 years ago, my entire family collapsed in a single moment. My mother, the woman who had been the emotional pillar for all of us for 30 years, passed away after an illness that came on so quickly none of us had time to prepare mentally. But no one was damaged more than my father. I still remember the morning of the funeral vividly. The sky was gray, a light drizzle falling as if nature itself was mourning my mother. Dad stood by the casket, his shoulders slumped, his face frighteningly empty. He wasn't crying, all tears seemed to have been exhausted after nights of sleeplessness. Instead, in his eyes was a hollow vacancy, as if part of his soul had been buried along with my mother. "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" I asked as we stood behind the crowd of mourners. He nodded, a mechanical gesture, utterly unconvincing. "I'll try," he answered, his voice hoarse. But he wasn't okay. How could he be? After 30 years together, losing your spouse isn't just losing a family member, it's losing part of yourself, part of the life you've built. And for my father, Mom wasn't just his wife, she was his best friend, his companion, and his source of strength. 3 months after the funeral, things got even worse. Dad lost his job, not because he wasn't capable, but simply because he wasn't himself anymore. He slipped into a depression so deep he couldn't focus on work. Continued absences and mistakes led to his dismissal. "You don't need to worry," I reassured him when he called with the news, his voice shaking with shame. "You can find another job when you're ready." But the new job never came. Instead, bills began to pile up, savings dwindled, and after 6 months, Dad couldn't afford the rent on his apartment anymore. "I don't know what to do," he confessed during a desperate call, his voice breaking. "I've tried, but everything is just so hard." I sat in my living room, phone pressed to my ear, feeling my heart ache for my father's pain. I was their only child, and now I was also the only one who could help him. "I'll help you," I said, determination in my voice. "I'll help you find a place to live." And that's exactly what I did. I spent every penny of my savings to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood, not far from where I lived. It wasn't a big or fancy house, just a modest 3-bedroom with a small backyard, but it was a safe, cozy place my father could call home. More importantly, it was a place where he could start over, could heal from the wound my mother's death had left. "You didn't have to do this," my father protested when I first showed him the house, tears glistening in his eyes. "I wanted to," I affirmed, squeezing his hand. "Mom would have wanted it too." We moved Charlie, my parents' old dog, in with him. Charlie was an 8-year-old cream-colored Labrador, an integral part of our family. My mother had adopted him as a puppy, and Charlie had become her faithful companion. After Mom died, Charlie was like the final connection between my father and his late wife. "Charlie seems to be adapting quickly," I remarked as I watched him sniffing around the backyard on the first day. "He was always a smart dog," Dad said, a rare smile flitting across his haggard face as Charlie ran around, tail wagging happily. "Your mother always said Charlie understood us better than we thought." In those first months, I visited Dad every weekend. We established a routine. I would bring groceries, Dad would grill burgers in the backyard, and we would sit and talk while Charlie lay at our feet, content and secure. Sometimes we'd talk about Mom, sharing memories that warmed our hearts. Other times, we'd just sit in comfortable silence, enjoying each other's presence. Gradually, I began to notice a change in my father. His smiles appeared more frequently, his eyes brighter. He started gardening, a hobby he'd never had time to pursue before. He planted rows of vegetables in the backyard and even created a small flower garden that he named Linda's Garden after my mother. "Your mother would have loved these roses," he would say, proudly pointing to newly blooming buds. Time passed, and I began to hope that perhaps, just maybe, things would be okay. Of course, Dad would never fully get over my mother's death, how could he? But at least he was learning to live on. He was learning to find joy in small things, learning to continue without forgetting. But then Sandy appeared, and everything began to change. I still remember the first time Dad mentioned Sandy. It was a Sunday afternoon, more than 2 years after Mom had passed away. Dad and I were having lunch in the backyard, as usual. "I've met someone," he announced, a hint of hesitation in his voice. I paused eating, surprised but not shocked. After all, Dad had been alone for too long. "Really? Who is she?" "Her name is Sandy," he said, looking down at his plate rather than at me. "We met at a neighborhood gathering last week. She's very nice, and we talked a lot." That's great, Dad, I replied sincerely. I genuinely wanted my father to have companionship. Do you plan to see her again? Dad nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. We're going out for dinner on Friday. In the months that followed, Sandy became a regular part of our conversations. Dad would tell me about their dates, the places they'd gone, and the things they'd done. I could see that she was bringing him joy and companionship that he had long been missing. I hadn't met her yet, but I was grateful to her for bringing life back to my father's eyes. Then one day, Dad invited me over for dinner to meet Sandy. It's time the two most important people in my life met, he said, his smile beaming through the phone. When I arrived at Dad's house that evening, Sandy was already there, busy in the kitchen. She was a tall woman with short brown hair dyed a light blonde. She appeared to be a bit older than my father, perhaps in her late 50s, but she kept herself in good shape. Hello, you must be Michael, she said, wiping her hands on her apron and coming over to hug me. I've heard so much about you. James doesn't stop talking about his wonderful son. I was taken aback by her warmth, but it was a pleasant surprise. It's nice to meet you, Sandy, I replied, smiling as she pulled me into a tight hug. Charlie, who usually greeted me with happy barks and a wagging tail, seemed more reserved with Sandy. He lay in the corner, watching us with wary eyes. When Sandy tried to pet him, he gently backed away, emitting a small whimper. Don't mind Charlie, Dad said, patting the dog's head. He's just a grumpy old dog. It will take him a while to get used to new things. Dinner went quite smoothly. Sandy was charming and attentive, asking me about my work, my life, and even about my memories with Mom. She didn't try to come across as trying to replace my mother, which I appreciated. My ex-husband passed away a few years ago too, she shared during dinner. I know nothing can replace a spouse, but sometimes, life gives us a second chance to find friendship and companionship. Dad reached across the table to hold her hand, and I could see that he was genuinely happy. So when, 2 months later, Dad called to announce that he and Sandy had decided to get married, I wasn't overly surprised. Do you think it's too soon? Dad asked, anxiety evident in his voice. Dad, you're a grown man, I reassured him. If Sandy makes you happy, then I'm happy. Looking back, I wish I had been more careful, wish I had seen the signs. But how could I have known what was coming? How could I have known that this marriage would open the door to a nightmare none of us saw coming? The wedding was a simple affair at the local registry office, with just me and a few of Sandy's friends as witnesses. Afterward, as if it had all been pre-arranged, Sandy moved into Dad's house, the house I had bought for him. At first, things seemed fine. Sandy appeared to be very attentive to Dad. Whenever I'd drop by, Dad looked happier, healthier. Sandy always made sure he ate properly, always made sure he took his medications on time, and even encouraged him to engage in social activities he had previously declined. She's really good for him, I told my wife, Sarah, after one visit. He looks so much better than before. But then, things began to change gradually. First, it was small changes around the house. Furniture was rearranged. My mother's portrait was moved from the living room to the master bedroom. A larger TV appeared in the living room, and the old sofa was replaced with a new one. Sandy wants to make the house look a bit fresher, Dad explained when I noticed the changes. She has a good eye for aesthetics, doesn't she? I didn't know what to say. On one hand, it was natural for Sandy to want to put her mark on the house. On the other hand, seeing the last traces of my mother systematically erased made me uncomfortable. It wasn't the house my mother had lived in, but it still contained memories of her, photographs, small items she had cherished. Now, they were gradually disappearing. Then, about 6 months after the wedding, I came to visit and found a strange woman sitting in the living room. Michael, this is Tina, Dad introduced. Sandy's daughter. Tina, a young woman in her late 20s, half-heartedly raised her hand to greet me. Hi, she said without looking up from her phone. Tina's only staying here temporarily, Sandy explained, patting her daughter's leg. She just broke up with her boyfriend and needs a place to stay for a few weeks until she finds a new place. But a few weeks quickly turned into months, and each time I visited, I found that Tina had begun adding more and more of her belongings. The living room began to be littered with her clothes. The fridge was filled with foods I knew Dad never ate. And Dad, always wanting to keep the peace, just smiled and appeared comfortable with all the changes. I don't mind having more people in the house, he said when I asked him about it. Actually, having Tina here makes Sandy happy, and I want to make her happy. I swallowed my disapproval. After all, it was Dad's life, and if he was okay with Tina being there, it wasn't my place to object. But then, as if on cue, Beth, Sandy's youngest daughter, also showed up. "She's just going through a rough patch," Sandy explained when I discovered another young woman living in the third bedroom. "She lost her job and couldn't afford rent. We couldn't let her be homeless, could we?" And just like that, the small house I had bought for my father suddenly became crowded. Sandy, Tina, Beth, and Dad, all living under one roof. I didn't feel comfortable visiting anymore. Each time I came over, I had to wade through piles of shoes at the entrance, and squeeze past carelessly tossed bags and coats. The space that had once been my father's quiet refuge had turned into a chaotic communal living area. But the worst part was seeing my father being marginalized in his own home. He wasn't the center anymore, he was just an accessory to the new life Sandy had created around him. The living room that had once been where he sat reading books and listening to classical music now constantly blared pop music and reality TV shows. The backyard, where he had tended to his garden, was now neglected, the flowers and vegetables left to the weeds. I tried not to interfere, but it was hard watching my father become increasingly distant, smaller in his own home. Part of me wanted to say something, wanted to stand up for him, but I knew it wasn't my place. If he was happy, or at least accepting, of the new arrangement, then who was I to intervene? But my patience reached its limit when Sandy and her daughters started targeting Charlie. It started with small complaints. I was sitting with Dad in the backyard, Charlie lying at our feet, when Beth poked her head out the back door. "Please keep that dog out here," she called over, frowning at Charlie. "He leaves hair all over the house, and I'm trying to keep my stuff clean." I looked at Charlie, the harmless old dog lying quietly, eyes half closed in the late afternoon sun. "Don't worry," Dad replied, offering a weak smile. "We'll stay out here." I felt irritation rise. "This is still your house, you know," I said quietly after Beth had closed the door. "Charlie can be wherever you want him to be." Dad just shrugged. "It's fine. Charlie prefers it out here anyway. And honestly, he's getting old and forgetful. He has accidents in the house sometimes." I swallowed my objections, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. Charlie had always been a part of our family, a part of Dad's life. Now he was being pushed aside as a nuisance. The complaints about Charlie grew more frequent in the following weeks. Sandy would wrinkle her nose whenever Charlie walked past her. Tina would complain about the old dog smell in the house. And Beth, the most vocal, would be conspicuously absent whenever Charlie was indoors. "I just don't feel safe with that dog around," she told Dad one day, loud enough for me to hear from the backyard. I couldn't hold back anymore. I walked in, catching Beth standing in the middle of the living room, a look of fake fear on her face as she stared at Charlie, who was lying peacefully under the coffee table. "Safe?" I asked, unable to hide the skepticism in my voice. "Charlie is 12 years old, can barely climb the stairs without needing a rest. He's never bitten anyone in his life." Beth turned to me, irritated. "You don't understand. I'm afraid of dogs. Especially big ones like that." "Then why did you move into a house that already had a dog?" I couldn't stop myself from asking. "That's enough," Sandy interjected, walking in from the kitchen. "Beth has a right to feel safe in her own home." I bit my lip, stopping myself from saying that this wasn't their home. Instead, I looked at my father, hoping he would say something, defend Charlie. But he just stood there, his face tired and defeated. "Maybe we can find a way to keep Charlie away from Beth," he suggested weakly. My heart sank. My father, once so strong and steadfast, was now yielding to every demand from Sandy and her daughters. This wasn't the man I knew. Not the man who had raised me. Things got worse from there. What started as complaints had transitioned into direct demands for Charlie's removal. "I don't think we should keep Charlie anymore," Sandy declared one evening when I was there. "He's old, and taking care of him is expensive. Plus, Beth is really uncomfortable having him around." Dad looked down at Charlie, lying at his feet as usual, and I could see the pain in his eyes. Charlie wasn't just a dog, he was a part of Dad's previous life, a part of his memories with Mom. Asking him to give up Charlie was like asking him to give up the last remaining piece of my mother's memory. "Charlie has been with us for so long," Dad said softly. "I'm not sure I can." "James, it's time to let go," Sandy interrupted, her voice firm. "He's just making everything harder, especially for Beth." I couldn't stay silent anymore. "Charlie stays," I declared, my voice shaking with anger. "If the issue is cost, I'll pay for all the vet bills. But Charlie is a part of this family, and he stays." Sandy looked at me, clearly displeased with my intervention. "This isn't really your decision, Michael." "It's not yours either," I shot back, trying to keep my voice calm. "Charlie is Dad's dog." The tension in the room rose, and I could see Dad shrinking into himself as if wanting to disappear. He hated conflict, always had, and I knew this confrontation was causing him distress. "I'll take Charlie to my house," I finally offered, looking at Dad. "Charlie can stay with me, and you can visit him whenever you want." The offer pained me. I knew taking Charlie away would hurt Dad, but I also knew there was no other way. Sandy and her daughters wouldn't stop until they got rid of Charlie, and I couldn't let that happen. At least with me, Charlie would be safe and loved. Dad looked at me, grateful and sad at the same time. "That might be the best idea," he agreed, his voice small. So that weekend, I took Charlie home with me. I had prepared a warm bed, new toys, and plenty of love. Charlie adapted better than I expected, though I could tell he missed Dad. Whenever there was a doorbell, he would run to the door, tail wagging furiously, hoping it was Dad. "Dad will visit soon," I would promise him, stroking his sleek fur. But that promise was harder to keep than I thought. Whenever I suggested bringing Charlie over for a visit, there would always be a reason why it was a bad idea. Beth was having a bad day, Sandy had just cleaned the house, or Dad wasn't feeling well. I knew these were just excuses, pretexts to keep Charlie away from the house. So I changed tactics. Instead of asking permission, I started bringing Charlie with me whenever I visited. I would show up at the door with Charlie by my side, and before Sandy or her daughters could object, I would lead Charlie straight to the backyard, where Dad was usually waiting. The joy on Dad's face when he saw Charlie said it all. He would kneel down, despite his aching knees, and hug Charlie, letting him lick his face and wag his tail like crazy. In those moments, I could see my dad come back to himself, happy, vibrant, and fully present. "He misses you," I would say, watching the two old friends reunite. "I miss him too," Dad would admit, his eyes lighting up with a joy I rarely saw these days. But that joy was always short-lived. Sandy or one of her daughters would find a reason to interrupt, to remind us of their presence, of their power. Sometimes it was Tina, urging Dad to help her with some household task. Other times it was Beth, declaring that she needed the backyard space for something. And always, Dad would yield. I began to notice a pattern. Sandy and her daughters weren't just taking over the physical space of the house, they were taking over Dad's mental space. They were systematically isolating him, cutting him off from the things that brought him joy and meaning. To them, Dad wasn't a person but a means to a free house, a roof over their heads. What scared me most was that their relationship seemed to be growing toxic. I noticed the way Sandy spoke to Dad, not with the respect a wife should have for her husband, but with the contempt of a manager for a troublesome employee. She would order him around, humiliate him in front of her daughters, and withhold affection unless he did her bidding. I tried to talk to Dad about the situation, but he always made excuses for Sandy's behavior. "She's just having a hard time," he would say. "Beth is going through a difficult phase, and Tina is looking for a job. Sandy is just worried about her girls. But what about you?" I would ask. "Who's worried about you?" Dad would just smile weakly and pat my hand. "I'm fine, Michael. Don't worry about me." But of course, I worried. How could I not worry when I saw the man who raised me, the strong and confident man I had always looked up to, being reduced to a shadow of himself? How could I sit by when I saw him being treated like a child, like a burden, in his own house, the house I had bought for him? Things got worse when Dad's health began to decline. He had always had heart problems, and stress didn't help. He started forgetting to take his medication, became more forgetful, and each time I visited, he looked older and more tired. "You need to see a doctor," I told him after seeing him gasping for breath after climbing the stairs. "I already did," he admitted. "They want me to go to the hospital for further tests." My heart raced. "When?" "Next week," he said, his voice tense. "They think I might need surgery." I tried not to let the worry show on my face. "I'll take you," I promised. "And I'll be there with you the whole time." Dad smiled gratefully, but then Sandy intervened. "That won't be necessary, Michael," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "I'll take James. You have your work to worry about, and I'm sure you're very busy." I wanted to object, but Dad had gripped my hand. "Let Sandy handle this," he said quietly. "I'll be fine." A feeling of helplessness washed over me as I nodded in agreement. I knew Sandy didn't like me, knew she saw me as a threat to her control, but there wasn't much I could do about it. Dad had made his choice, and I had to respect that, no matter how worried I was. But as I left that day, I couldn't help feeling that time was running out. Not just for Dad's health, but for my ability to keep him safe from the woman who seemed to care only about what she could take from him. The following week, Dad was admitted to the hospital for heart tests. I called the hospital to confirm that my name was listed among those allowed to visit him, then I visited as soon as I could. I found him lying in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile under the white sheets and among the medical machinery. "Dad," I called softly, my heart aching at the sight of him like this. He opened his eyes and smiled when he saw me. "Michael. You came." "Of course," I said, sitting down beside the bed and taking his hand. "I told you I would be here." "Sandy said you'd be too busy," he said, his voice soft and tired. I felt a flash of anger but pushed it aside. "I'm never too busy to be with you," I said firmly. We talked for a while about his condition, about the tests the doctors were running and what they hoped to find. Then, as the conversation lulled, Dad squeezed my hand. "Michael, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "What is it, Dad?" I asked, feeling apprehensive. "If anything happens to me," he said, "I want you to know that I'm very grateful for everything you've done. The house, all the help, taking care of Charlie, everything." "Dad," I interrupted, feeling a panic rise. "Don't talk as if you're going to." "I need to say this," he insisted. "I know Sandy and her daughters haven't always been pleasant. I know they haven't treated you or Charlie well. But I want you to know that I see it all. I see how you always try to protect me, how you bring Charlie to visit despite Sandy not wanting it. I see it all, and I'm grateful, son." I felt my throat tighten. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "I do those things because I love you." "I know," he said, smiling sadly. "And I love you. That's why I need you to promise me something." "Anything," I said immediately. "If anything happens to me," he continued, his voice becoming firmer, "you won't let Sandy take the house. It's your house. You bought it with your own money, and I don't want to see Sandy and her daughters living there after I'm gone." I was stunned by his words. This was the first time Dad had acknowledged that he knew about Sandy's intentions. "You know?" I asked. He nodded, his face weary. "I'm not stupid, son. I know Sandy married me for money. I know she thinks the house will be hers after I die. She's hinted at it clearly enough." "Then why?" I started to ask, but couldn't find the words. "Why do I stay with her?" he asked, guessing my question. "Because I was lonely, Michael. After your mother died, I was so lonely I thought I couldn't bear it. And Sandy, despite all her flaws, made me feel less alone. She gave me a purpose, a reason to continue. I know that's not a good reason to get married, but I didn't know what else to do." My heart broke for my father. I understood how loneliness could drive people to desperate measures. "I understand, Dad," I said softly. "But now I realize my mistake," he continued. "I see how Sandy treats me, how she tries to isolate me from you and Charlie. I've let her do it for too long, and I'm sorry. But I don't want her to be rewarded for taking advantage of me. So I need you to promise me, don't let her take the house." "I promise," I said, squeezing his hand. "I won't ever let that happen." Dad exhaled, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "And one more thing, take care of Charlie. Never let Sandy get him. Charlie is yours and your mother's, and I want him to be with you." "I promise," I repeated, tears welling in my eyes. We sat in silence after that, just being together, hand in hand. I felt as if we had finally been honest with each other, as if the walls between us had finally crumbled. "I love you, Dad," I said. "I love you too," he replied, smiling. That conversation changed everything for me. There was no more feeling of helplessness. Now, I had a mission, a promise to keep. Dad had trusted me to protect what was his, and I wouldn't let him down. In the weeks that followed, as Dad recovered from his tests, I began to prepare. I talked to my lawyer, made sure all the paperwork was in order, and I started planning for the worst. The doctors had confirmed that Dad needed heart surgery, a risky procedure at his age. I hoped for the best but prepared for the worst. As the surgery date approached, I began visiting Dad more frequently, bringing Charlie whenever I could. Sandy was clearly unhappy about this, but after my conversation with Dad, I no longer cared about pleasing her. I was there for Dad, not for her. A week before the surgery, I visited and found Sandy and her daughters sitting in the living room, heads bent, whispering to each other. They fell silent as I walked in, but I could sense an atmosphere of conspiracy. "Where's Dad?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "In the bedroom," Sandy replied, not looking at me. "He's resting. Don't disturb him." "I'll see how he is," I replied, heading toward the hallway that led to the master bedroom. "Wait," Tina called after me, "we just put him down for a nap. He needs rest." I paused, considering her words. Part of me wanted to believe they truly cared about Dad's rest, but another part was wary. Something wasn't right. "I'll just peek in for a minute," I said, continuing to walk. "I don't want to disturb him." When I reached the bedroom door, I heard low voices from inside. I knocked gently, and when no one answered, I cracked the door open to look inside. Dad was lying on the bed, but he wasn't asleep. He was talking to a man in a suit who was sitting on the chair near the bed. There was a stack of papers on Dad's lap and a pen in his hand. "Dad?" I called, opening the door wider. Dad and the other man both turned to look at me, surprise evident on their faces. "Michael," Dad said, hurriedly folding the papers. "What are you doing here?" "I came to visit you," I replied, stepping into the room, my eyes not leaving the stranger. "What's going on?" The man looked uncomfortable, but he stood up and introduced himself. "I'm Harold Thompson, Mrs. Sandy's family attorney." "Attorney?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "What are you doing with an attorney, Dad?" Dad looked down at the stack of papers on his lap, then up at me with a guilty expression. "Sandy thought I should update my will," he admitted. "In case the surgery doesn't go well." "And you didn't think to tell me about this?" I asked, feeling betrayed. "What are you changing in your will?" Dad hesitated, looking at Mr. Thompson as if seeking help. Mr. Thompson just coughed slightly and began gathering his papers. "Perhaps I should leave you two to talk privately," he said, heading for the door. "Don't be in such a hurry," I said, blocking his path. "I want to know what my father is signing." "Michael," Dad called, his voice tired. "Please don't make this harder." "Harder? I'm trying to protect you from being taken advantage of," I said, turning to look at him. "I know Sandy wants you to change your will so she can get the house." "Michael, Mr. Thompson has explained," Dad said. "Legally, Sandy has a right to inherit my property as my wife. And I want her to have a place to live if anything happens to me." "But Dad," I pleaded, "have you forgotten? That house isn't yours. I bought it for you. My name is on the deed." Dad's face paled, and he looked at Mr. Thompson in confusion. "What?" he asked. Mr. Thompson frowned. "Mr. James, you told me you own the house." "No, Sandy said that," Dad replied, his face bewildered. "She told me that I own the house, that I had bought it before I met her." I felt rage building. "That's a lie," I said. "I bought that house for you after Mom died. My name has always been on the papers. You don't own it, you never did." A suffocating silence fell over the room as Dad realized he had been deceived. He looked at the papers on his lap, then at me, his eyes full of pain and shame. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought." Sandy said. I shook my head, trying to control my anger. "She lied to you," I said. "She wanted you to leave the house to her in your will, but you can't leave something that isn't yours." Mr. Thompson looked from me to Dad, clearly uncomfortable. "I think we should pause this until things are clarified," he said, gathering his papers. "I think you should go," I told him. "And tell Sandy her little plan has failed." Mr. Thompson nodded awkwardly and quickly left, leaving Dad and me alone. As the door closed, Dad buried his face in his hands. "I've been such a fool," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been so stupid." I sat down beside him, my anger dissolving as I saw his pain. "You're not stupid," I reassured him. "You just trusted someone you loved. That's not stupidity, that's being human." "I said terrible things about you," he admitted, not looking at me. "Sandy told me you were trying to take advantage of me, that you only cared about money and property. She said that if I left everything to her, she would make sure you got a share too." I believed her. "It's okay," I said, though my heart ached. "What matters is that you know the truth now." Dad took my hand, his eyes finally meeting mine. "Michael, I'm sorry. I've let Sandy control me for too long. I let her drive Charlie away, let her treat you badly, and now I realize she's been deceiving me from the start. We can fix this," I assured him. "You don't have to keep living like this. You can come stay with me. There's plenty of room, and Charlie would be so happy to have you there." A glimmer of hope flickered in Dad's eyes. "You think so?" "I know so," I said, smiling at him. "We can start over, Dad. Just you, me, and Charlie." Dad squeezed my hand, and I could see a new determination forming in his eyes. "I'll talk to Sandy," he said. "After the surgery, when I'm stronger, I'll tell her I want a divorce." The word shocked me, not because I didn't want Dad to escape Sandy, but because I had never thought he would actually do it. "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded, his face resolute. "I can't go on like this, Michael. Sandy isn't who I thought she was. And in the end, I couldn't do it. I couldn't betray your mother like that. I felt a wave of love and respect for the man who had raised me. Despite all the setbacks, he was still the man of integrity I had always known him to be. I'm here for you, I promised. Whatever you need. We hugged, and in that moment, I felt as if a heavy load had been lifted from our shoulders. At last, we had seen Sandy for who she truly was, and at last, we could do something about it. But fate had other plans. The surgery didn't go well. Despite the surgeon being one of the best in his field, Dad's heart was simply too weak to withstand the stress of the procedure. He didn't make it through the surgery. I still remember the moment the doctor emerged from the operating room, his face grave as he approached me in the waiting area. "Mr. Thompson?" he called, using Dad's last name. "That's me," I replied, standing up, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm very sorry," he said, his voice dropping. We did everything we could, but his heart stopped on the operating table. We couldn't get it to start again. The world around me disappeared as those words sank in. My father, the man who had raised me, loved me, and taught me everything I knew, was gone. I would never talk to him again, never see his smile, never feel his embrace. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with shock, but eventually, I felt someone's hand touch my shoulder. "Michael?" I turned and saw Sandy, standing there with Tina and Beth. I hadn't seen them when I arrived at the hospital. They had come late, after Dad had already been taken into surgery. "He's gone," I said, my voice feeling alien to myself. I waited to see grief on Sandy's face, waited for tears or cries. Instead, I witnessed the most horrifying thing, a fleeting smile on her lips before she quickly covered it with a frown. "Oh no," she said, her voice lacking any sincerity. "Poor James." I stood there, stunned by her coldness. This woman, who had married my father, who had vowed to love him in sickness and in health, felt no grief at his passing. Instead, I could see calculation in her eyes, as if she was thinking about what she would do next, about how she would capitalize on this situation. I couldn't bear to be near them, so I left the hospital, needing fresh air and time alone. I drove home, where Charlie was waiting for me. As I walked in, he looked up at me with his big round eyes, his tail wagging gently. "Dad's gone, Charlie," I whispered, kneeling to hug him. "Dad's gone." Charlie seemed to understand, resting his head on my shoulder and whimpering softly. We sat like that for a while, easing each other's grief. The days that followed passed in a fog of sorrow. I arranged for the funeral, chose the casket, selected the songs, and wrote the eulogy. Sandy was barely involved in the process, showing up only to do the bare minimum required. She seemed impatient, as if she just wanted to get it all over with so she could move on with her life. The funeral took place on a gloomy Tuesday, a light drizzle falling, making the atmosphere even more somber. I stood before the mourners, speaking about the man my father had been, about his kindness, his compassion, and his unconditional love. I talked about how he had loved my mother, about how he had built a life with her, and about how he had lost a part of his soul when she passed away. Standing in the crowd, I could see Sandy, dressed as if she were attending a party rather than a funeral. She maintained a sad face when people looked, but I caught her checking her phone and whispering to Tina throughout the service. For her, this seemed to be merely an obstacle to overcome before she could enjoy her reward, the house she believed was now hers. After the funeral, people gathered at Dad's house, the house I had bought for him, to pay their respects. I stood in the corner, watching Sandy as she moved among the guests, accepting condolences with a perfectly rehearsed somber expression. I wondered how many of these people knew the truth about her, knew who she really was. When the last guests had left, I found Sandy, Tina, and Beth in the living room, all sitting on the sofa with glasses of wine in their hands. They didn't look like people who were grieving, they looked like people who had just completed a difficult task and were now relaxing. I stood in the doorway, watching them for a moment. They didn't notice me until I finally spoke. "So shall we talk about it?" I asked, my voice hard. Sandy turned, momentarily looking surprised, but then quickly regaining her composure. "Talk about what, Michael?" she asked, her voice falsely sweet. "About you moving out," I said bluntly. "I want you all out of this house by the end of the week." Sandy set down her wine glass, her face hardening. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, Michael," she said, her voice cold. "This is my house now. James left it to me." "No, he didn't," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite the emotions boiling inside. "He couldn't leave what wasn't his. This house belongs to me. Always has." Sandy laughed lightly, but I could see a trace of worry in her eyes. "There's no way that's true," she said. James lived here for years. Yes, he lived here, I agreed, in the house that I bought for him after my mother died. He never owned this house. It has always been in my name. I pulled out a folder from my coat pocket, placing it on the coffee table. Here's the deed, with clear ownership belonging to me. There's also a notice from my lawyer, letting you know you have 30 days to vacate the property or the matter will be taken to court. Sandy picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the pages, confusion evident on her face. This can't be true, she muttered. James said. What did he say? I asked. That he owned the house? That's because you lied to him. You told him he owned it when you knew very well he didn't. Tina stood up, her face red with anger. You can't do this to us, she yelled. We'll have nowhere to go. That's not my problem, I replied, keeping my voice steady. You've lived here for free long enough. It's time for you to leave and find a place of your own. Beth, who had been silent until now, started crying, obviously fake tears rolling down her cheeks. James wouldn't want this, she sobbed. He would want us to stay. You don't know what my father would want, I shot back, anger finally showing in my voice. You didn't care about my father, you only cared about what you could get from him. You took advantage of him while he was alive, and now you're trying to take advantage of him in death. Well, it's not happening. Sandy stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. You'll regret this, Michael, she threatened. I was James's wife, and I have rights. You have no rights at all, I said, picking up the folder again. You have 30 days. After that, if you're still here, I'll have people come to escort you out. With those words, I turned and walked out of the room, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I had kept my promise to my father. I hadn't allowed Sandy and her daughters to take the house. I had protected his legacy, just as he had asked me to. Of course, Sandy didn't give up that easily. In the weeks following my father's funeral, she did her utmost to fight me. She hired a lawyer, trying to claim ownership of the house based on the fact that she had lived there for several years. She made claims about Dad having promised the house to her, about her having invested in it, about it being her home as much as his. But in the end, it was all futile. My lawyer had all the necessary paperwork to prove my ownership, and no court would rule otherwise. After a brief legal battle, Sandy and her daughters were forced to leave. They weren't happy about it, there were threats, tears, and even some property damage, but eventually, they were gone. Finally, the house was back to being mine. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I would do with it. Most of the time when I walked in, I could still hear my father's laughter, could still envision him sitting in his favorite armchair, Charlie lying at his feet. Those memories pained me but also comforted me in my grief. One day, about a month after Sandy and her daughters had left, I came to the house to clean out some of Dad's remaining belongings. I brought Charlie along, thinking he might like to revisit the place he had once called home. As we entered, Charlie ran straight to the master bedroom, where Dad used to sleep. Curious, I followed him. I found him sniffing at a specific spot under the bed, his tail wagging vigorously in a way I hadn't seen since Dad died. Kneeling down, I looked under the bed and saw a small box pushed into the corner, almost invisible in the darkness. I reached for it and pulled it out. It was a simple wooden box with my mother's name, Linda, carved on the lid. I opened it, and tears welled in my eyes as I saw what was inside: photographs of my mother, letters she had written to Dad, her wedding necklace, and a small card with Dad's handwriting. My dear Linda, my love, my soul, not a day goes by that I don't miss you. I hope that wherever you are, you know that I still love you. Forever yours, James. The date on the card was just 2 weeks before Dad passed away. He had kept this box all these years, hidden it from Sandy, as a way to maintain a connection with the woman he truly loved. No matter how hard Sandy tried to erase my mother's presence from the house, Dad had kept these memories, remained faithful to his first love. I hugged the box to my chest, tears streaming down my cheeks as I realized this. Charlie rested his head on my knee, as if sensing my grief, and we sat there together, sharing a moment of connection with the two people we had lost. Later, as I gently placed the items back into the box, I realized that I knew exactly what to do with the house. I wouldn't sell it, wouldn't rent it, and certainly wouldn't live in it. Instead, I would donate it to a local charity that worked with lonely elderly people, people like my father, who had lost their spouses and were struggling to find meaning and connection in their later years. The house would become a community center, a place where elderly people could gather, make friends, and find purpose. It would be a worthy legacy for my father, a way to turn his pain into hope for others. So that's exactly what I did. Today, the James Thompson Community Center serves dozens of seniors each week. There are book clubs, gardening classes, in the garden that Dad had started, and even a pet therapy program where dogs like Charlie visit to bring joy and friendship. As for Sandy and her daughters, I heard they moved to another city, perhaps looking for another man to exploit, another target for their schemes. I don't care. They're no longer a part of my life, and I'm happy to keep it that way. There are days I still wonder if I could have done more to protect Dad while he was alive, if I could have seen Sandy for who she truly was sooner. But then I remind myself that I kept my final promise to him. I protected the house he loved, I took care of Charlie, and I made sure Sandy wasn't rewarded for taking advantage of him. And, most importantly, I turned his pain into something positive, a place that uplifts others, a place full of love and connection, just as my father had uplifted and loved me. Charlie lived for 2 more years after Dad's death, happy and loved until his final days. When he passed, I buried him under the apple tree in the community center's garden, near the small flower garden Dad had named after my mother. I like to think all 3 of them are there somehow, in the flowers, in the laughter of the seniors playing in the yard, and in the love that continues to live long after they've gone. The house that I bought for my father didn't become the happy sanctuary I had hoped it would. For a time, it became a prison, a place where Dad was bullied and manipulated. But now, finally, it has become what it always had the potential to be, a place of healing, a place of connection, and a legacy that will live on forever. And that, I think, would make my father very proud.